Mr. President, I'm pleased that the senator from North Dakota joined us because I think he made a very valid point, something that I should have explained better. It's not just the fear of having to pay more taxes, but it's the reality you don't have the income to pay the tax, therefore requiring the sale of the assets, the sale of the farm machinery and equipment, the sale of the land, the sale of the cattle. And so while no one wants to pay more taxes, in this case, it is even more onerous in that you have value to assets. You have some wealth in the land and the equipment and the cattle, but never the sufficient income to pay the tax, and therefore the sale of those assets is required to pay the tax man, and therefore you don't have those assets that I was talking about earlier to pass on to your children and grandchildren. So this is not just about I already pay enough taxes, I don't want to pay anymore, I can't afford anymore. This is the reality that I don't have the ability at all to come up with the income, unless, as the senator from North Dakota says, I go to the bank and borrow the money, but then I don't have the cash flow to repay the loan, and therefore I sell the property. And it comes at a time when many Kansans, farmers, and others would complain about how business and agriculture keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The reality is we would love to have those farming operations, that family-sized farming scale that's so important to the cultural and economic vitality of communities across Kansas and across America. But because we have laws like the state tax, we sell those assets to bigger entities who can better afford, and we reduce the number of family farms that most of us believe are so important to who we are as Americans, and certainly so important to the economy and the cultural nature of rural America. And this comes at a time in which I've heard the discussion here on the floor today about the Farm Bill. And I know that my colleagues, the senator from South Dakota, the senator from North Dakota, have encouraged passage of a Farm Bill by the entire Congress. But this Farm Bill, let me remind you, is a reduction in Farm Bill spending only really on the side of production agriculture, of family farms across Kansas, a reduction in the amount of money available under the Farm Bill of $23 billion. And farmers in Kansas tell me they're willing to take their so-called hit to help reduce the country's fiscal condition. We're willing to take the $23 billion out of farm programs, but don't do other things to us that eliminate or reduce our ability to earn a living. And so here comes Congress, just a few weeks after we pass a farm bill, reducing the amount of money available for farm programs by $23 billion, saying, oh, let's do something else damaging to agriculture, to farmers and ranchers. Let's impose an estate tax in which the threshold is $1 million and the marginal rate is 55%. So it goes back contrary to what those farmers say, which is we'll take our hit, we'll contribute to getting this country's fiscal house back in order, but let us have the opportunity under a free enterprise system to succeed. And now we have one more handicap, one more hurdle toward accomplishing that. And finally, let me say I was on the Senate floor yesterday talking about this issue, and particularly talking about a tax system. We need dramatic reform in our tax code. The idea that we would be extending the current tax law for the foreseeable future, we ought to be, this Congress, this president ought to be serious about scrapping the tax code and starting over with something much different. I spoke yesterday in favor of the fair tax, but regardless of what the conclusion is, we ought to have a simpler, fairer, more understandable tax code, and we ought to have the circumstance in which most taxpayers don't have to seek professional advice to figure out what it is they owe, or to spend their whole time as a farmer, a rancher, or a business person trying to figure out what do I do today that will have a positive or negative consequence upon the tax bill at the end of the year. We Americans spend a huge amount of time, a significant amount of money, in which we pay professionals to advise us how to avoid paying taxes. We desperately need a whole new tax code that is fairer, simpler, much more straightforward and understandable, so that we spend our time growing the economy as compared to spending our time trying to figure out how to manipulate the tax code and in the process lose our individual liberties and freedoms because we're all about trying to make certain that we comply with the tax code as compared to determining what's in the best interest of us as citizens, us as individuals, as family members, and us as business owners. So while it's important that we point out the onerous nature of the estate tax and what is about to happen here in a vote in about an hour, we ought to remind ourselves that there's a much more important goal than this Congress, this president have been willing to address. And that is scrap this code and get something that makes sense to the American people, that's understandable, affordable, and that pays the necessary amounts to fund those programs required for us to be a successful country. I would yield to the senator from South Dakota.
The senator from Kansas, I too look forward to working with him on fundamental tax reform, because that is at the essence